everyone. Welcome to Wind Down Wednesdays. I'm your host, Paula Taylor, and this is episode 181. Today we are going to talk about, it's a little bit of a dual subject. We're going to talk about what we can learn from the 3D, why we're still in the 3D, a little bit of that, and then we're going to, spoiler alert, it all leads to taking up space. This is a little bit of an extension of last week's show where we talked about re-empowerment and the 5D. As always, you don't have to have listened to last week's show, but I do recommend going back and listening to it because it'll probably help build a foundation for some of the things we're talking about today. So if you're new to the show, if you haven't been listening to me, when I say 3D, I mean physical reality and also this sort of energetic reality that humanity's been in for a long time. That's kind of either or, yes or no, black or white, all or nothing, a little bit more fear-based. 5D, more expansive, non-physical reality that we have more access to. We're not moving into 5D, we're keeping 3D bodies, which is partly why this is so difficult. 5D is more about inclusivity, unconditional love, and expansion. So I realized over the last few weeks, and especially this week, that I don't spend a lot of time in so-called 3D spaces, 3D energetic spaces. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and I'll try to be as clear as I can. 3D and 5D are just terms that we've chosen to use. I am going with those terms because some people have literacy around that. The 3D is our physical reality. We are not leaving that in this expansion. We are expanding out into the 5D. We're essentially making our energetic bodies bigger. So this is an energetic shift that is reflected in the physical, but we're not leaving the physical plane. And it's a difficult transition. And when I started talking about this and my guide started channeling information about August of 2023-ish, they were giving me this idea of like what was going to happen. But as we've talked about on previous shows, I'm not sure anybody really knew exactly what this meant. And I had a few experiences in the 3D recently, energetic 3D. So we're always in the 3D physically, but energetically to me, the 3D is kind of dense space. It's sort of fear-based space. It feels like a contracted space. And what I realized is that I have intentionally constructed my life so that I spend most of my time in that space of expansion, in this like 5D space. I left my medical job, which was a very 3D space. I have my own business where I'm intentionally creating this 5D expansion as much as I can. No one is perfect. I socialize with people for the most part we talk about the 5D all the time. They're open to these ideas. There are other energy workers, other practitioners, people who are somewhat energy savvy and aware, interested in spirituality. And so I went into a few 3D spaces recently that were very 3D and kind of dense. And I realized that there's a lot we can learn from that energetic space. So we've been talking for almost 2 years now, a year and a half, about this idea of the 3D and the 5D and sort of more recently, the idea that the 3D is kind of this like dense racquetball, this dense rubber ball that is, you know, a little bit contracted, a little bit fearful. And the 5D is this space of expansion around that. And I, again, have intentionally constructed my life to spend as much time as possible in the 5D. However, I had these two experiences where I realized that we have a lot to learn from the 3D. And it was kind of like a little light switch went off in my head. And I was like, oh, this is one of the reasons why we're not leaving the 3D. So broadly, we are here on this amazing physical planet that has this physical plane that has the potential to really hold 5D energy in a 3D physical plane. That is the ultimate goal here, is to bring this more expansive energy into the physical and allow this lightness, allow this expansion to happen in physical reality. So that's the like broad why we are together kind of thing, why we're not splitting physically. However, there's a personal why that I realized this week, which is that those of us that are in this transition that are here to kind of help with this, we're going through the transition too. And so the 3D is still a very fertile ground for self-learning, for expansion, for excavation, for recognizing the limiting beliefs that we're still holding on to, the trauma that we might still be carrying, the frequencies that are not clear, expanded, and harmonious, so that we can continue to expand into the 5D. We need that contrast to sort of help us continue to grow and continue to expand. And it's sort of this situation where the duality is an important part of the expansion. Without the duality, we would not know where we were going. We would not know where we were coming from. Without dark, we don't have light. Without contraction, we don't have expansion. And so there are very specific lessons that we can still learn in order to kind of expand further while we are in 3D spaces. And I'm talking about energetic 3D spaces here, just to be clear, because everything physically is a 3D space. So I've had a few experiences recently, and I realized as I was kind of trying to put this together, one of them happened a few weeks ago, and I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be on the show. And then it sort of coalesced. And then last night I was like, oh yeah, I see how all of this sort of comes together. Sometimes it takes a while to get there. So I'm going to talk first about a really expansive experience I had in the 3D this week, and then we'll get into the more contracted learning part. I'm going to start expanded and joyful, and then kind of get into the difficulty a little bit. So on Monday, I had to go to the DMV, or what they in Arizona call the MVD. I'm not sure. I don't know if any other state does that. Everywhere else, it's the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? The DMV. Notoriously a very contracted, dense kind of 3D energetic space. Nobody who's there wants to be there, including generally the people who work there. I do not blame them, because they're just dealing with angry people all day long. Somebody said to me, the DMV reminds them of Beetlejuice. And I was like, oh, like when you die and then you're in that waiting room and you're stuck in this like endless bureaucracy, and you have these big long numbers and you're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And I thought that was actually a pretty good analogy. So I went to the 3D. I went to the 3D DMV on Monday, and I had made an appointment. So I was like, my husband went, we had to go back. He went without an appointment and waited about the same time I did with the appointment. So I'm not sure what the point of the appointment was, but I was in a shorter line. It just was moving way slower. So again, that's a very 3D thing in it. So you make an appointment and then you just stand in line as long as the people who didn't. So I was waiting in line and, just kind of hanging out, and I was feeling really, really expanded. I was taking up a lot of space energetically. Physically, I was taking up a lot of space, and I was doing this intentionally. It's something that I've been working on. We'll get to why, because I'll backtrack a little bit when we get to the more contracted part of the story. But I was standing there. I was taking up a nice amount of space. The person in front of me and behind me were both actually giving me a nice amount of space, which I think was the result of kind of just the energy that I had around me. I was feeling really expansive. My guides were talking to me the whole time I was in there, and it was really funny. They were telling me, you need to go home and get on TikTok and go live and do these mini readings. And I was like, what? I don't really do that. And they're like, you're going to use Venmo and you're going to charge $11. And then I listened to them, and I just had the most beautiful, expansive experience, and I connected with some really beautiful people, and it's almost like they know what they're doing and I should listen to them. And I did, and I have been, and I've really been working on that and expanding more and more. So I was standing in the DMV, and I was feeling like super expanded and super amazing, and I was just like breathing and kind of being in the space and not minding that I was waiting, and just kind of like feeling really good. And I was noticing all of the density in the 3D space around me. The guy in front of me was like so impatient, and he was tapping his foot and he was sighing every once in a while, and just like, making it very clear that he was unhappy to be waiting and that he was impatient. There were people going in and out. There was just a lot of density in the space. And I had this really interesting experience, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit because I have heard this reflected back, especially from other practitioners recently. So I know I'm not the only one having this experience of the 3D physical reality seeming very surreal. So I was in this space. I could feel my crown was like hugely open. I felt really good in my body. My guides were talking to me. I was just having a nice conversation with them in my head, feeling really good. I was not feeling any of the angst in all of the people around me. People were going up to the counter, stomping away, getting sent away because they didn't have the right paperwork. That actually happened to me because it turned out my husband needed to be there because he had signed the title on this car we had bought. So I didn't wait for nothing. I had something else to do, but I understand, it's a frustrating thing. Bureaucracy is confusing. You think you have the right thing. It turns out you don't. So there were people all over the place who were angry and visibly angry and not yelling, but like making themselves heard in their anger and their frustration. And I felt none of it. And the more I kind of looked around, the more I started having this feeling like I was in The Sims. That's the feeling I had, which I don't know if that's maybe too old of a reference for some people, but there used to be this video game called The Sims, and it was basically just like a reality game. Like you created little people and the little people lived lives, and there were different versions of this. And I was like looking around the DMV and I was just like, oh, this is so weird. It was like the other image that popped into my head was like in The Matrix, when the character Neo, that's played by Keanu Reeves, when he starts seeing through the Matrix and he can like see all the numbers, he can see the computer programming that's behind this simulation that he's in. That's the other image that came to me, where I was looking around and I was just like, is any of this real? And then I was kind of like, well, obviously it is. And all these people are here and they're just doing the best they can. And it's okay that they're frustrated and they're just not necessarily in this expanded space. They're not accessing the 5D to the extent that I was in that moment. And I didn't have any judgment around it. It was a really interesting, I keep looking around because I can remember being there. It was a really interesting experience of how these realities are sort of laid on top of each other. I was almost exclusively, energetically, I was exclusively in a 5D or beyond space. I was fully expanded. I think when I visit my guides, technically that's like a 12D space if you're going to go with dimensions. It's in the celestial realm, very close to source, one differentiation from source. And I was fully connected in, and I was talking to them, and we were hanging out. And it was like I could feel that space around me, to the point where the space that I was physically standing in felt less real to me than the experience I was having with my guides. And it wasn't like a hallucination. I knew where I was. I could see everything that was going on. I was watching all the people, but it was almost this feeling of being in two places at once, where it was like I could feel my physical body and I was aware of the things that were around me. If someone had said something to me, I would have been fully conscious and able to communicate. This has been happening to me more and more recently. And I keep wondering, if I look weird or if I look different because I'm listening to someone and I'm engaged, but I'm having a whole different experience in the spiritual. Usually it's serving what I'm doing in the physical. I'm with a client and they're talking to me, but I'm also hearing information coming from my guides, and it's seamless in a way that it's never been before, thanks to some recent work that I've been doing and some physical work I've received. I'm so grateful to all of the practitioners that I see and I trade with that are in that 5D community that I've been building for the last several years. It's really important to have that. But what I realized in this 3D experience was that it's also important to understand how far you've come. And that was an experience to me of how far I've come on this spiritual journey. I was not only was I not personally feeling impatient or angry, even when I found out, I was a little bit frustrated when I found out that my husband needed to be there, even though he had signed this title. But it was a little bit just it was more about empowerment and taking up space, and this idea of why do I have to have a man here to do the thing? And it had nothing to do with him being a man. It triggered something in me because that's happened to me multiple times, where they're like, you need to have your husband here. And I'm like, but I'm the one on the account. What the heck? Very old patriarchal stuff. But it was a really good illustration to me of, so not only was I not getting drawn into that energetic 3D space of contraction, But as an empath, I was not feeling any of the things that the people around me, any of these like emotional, energetic darts and anger and frustration and unhappiness. None of that was coming into my space at all. It was that quantum superposition idea where I was in a completely different energetic space that was like superimposed, that was superpositioned on top of, or I don't know how to word that, overlapping with this dense 3D physical and energetic space. And the guy in front of me, it was so funny because he was like hemming and hawing and sighing, and like normally for me, when someone's doing that, I feel that in my body. I feel that tightness in my body, or I feel like somebody's kind of like pushing at me or punching me in the chest sometimes even. I felt amazing. I was just like, oh, I guess that guy's frustrated. Well, that's not my problem. And I was just like floating around and just like having a great time. And it was such a cool experience to be in a space that I think pretty much anyone you talk to would agree is a very dense and uncomfortable and not very fun place to be. Whether they use the word 3D or 5D, I think most people are like, yeah, the DMV, not my favorite place to go. And I just was like having the best time. And then my guides told me to come home and do that TikTok. And I was like, I never do that. But it was like, there was a very clear like message that was like, there are somebody or some people, there are people who need you to do this, and you need to do it today, and you need to do it now. And I was just like, I was just so in the flow. I was just like, sure, I've got the day open, I'll just do that. And then it turned into just this really beautiful exchange on TikTok. And it was just a wonderful illustration for me of how we can coexist, how the 3D and the 5D can coexist. Because a lot of times when we talk about it, we're still talking about it as this either or, the 3D or the 5D, like I just said. The 3D and the 5D are going to continue to coexist, both physically and energetically. But this separation energetically is kind of what this idea is. When people say we're going to be more and more separated, I was physically in the same place as the other 100-something probably people that were in that building in these various lines. And I was in a completely different energetic space, to the point that nothing that was happening in the space was even affecting me, even in the physical. I was not feeling anything in my physical body to reflect what was going on in the people around me. Usually, when I'm in a space where people are really upset and angry, it makes me very uncomfortable. And I don't like to go into spaces like that. And this not only did not make me uncomfortable, it did not affect me. I was just like, having the best day, just feeling, even when the lady was like, she couldn't help me with the second thing. And I hadn't made the appointment for that. I had made it for something else. So I was kind of like, they're probably not going to be able to help me anyway, but I'm here and I'll ask. And then I was like, again, I did get a little annoyed because it was like, I don't understand why he has to be here when he signed it and both of our names are on the thing. But anyway, 3D, what can I say? So that's my fun story about what we can learn from the 3D and taking up space. So that's a good example of taking up space, of owning your space, of allowing yourself physically and energetically to be really expanded and joyful, and not allowing whatever's going on around you to mess with that, and how it can be a beautiful experience even in a place that's maybe not a beautiful place. So let's move on to the other part of the story, which is also about 3D experiences and taking up space. And this is more about the lessons that we still have to learn, part of the reason that we're in 3D space. So my husband has been playing golf for many years. He played golf as a kid. He played golf all through high school. He's a good golfer. I would say a very good golfer. And he had not played. We moved to Arizona in 2009. Supposed to be an amazing place to play golf. You would think it's always sunny. It's just so hot and so windy here that we never really started playing. We never picked it back up. We played on and off. He taught me a little bit when we were in college, and then again when we were in ultrasound school. And I'm like a passable golfer. I'm occasionally decent, occasionally terrible, and there's like there's no consistency there, which is very frustrating for me. So playing golf for me is a very 3D, energetic 3D experience. It can be a very contracting experience. It can be a very frustrating experience. I was just talking with someone who got recently diagnosed with ADHD, And they were saying that one of the questions on like the questionnaire was about, did you get easily frustrated as a child? And I started laughing because I was like, as a child? I mean, it's still happening. I have never been the most patient person, especially with myself. And I learned so much in this contracted series of experiences that I knew I had to share this. So over the last month or so, my husband and I have played golf about 4 times. One time with a coworker of his, and then one time when we were in Mexico, and then 2 times actually in the last week or so. And at each of those experiences, I was able to recognize and learn something about some work that I still need to do to release some limiting beliefs, some like dense 3D stuff that's still in my field. And this really goes along with this re-empowerment. And so I wanted to talk about it. And the first time I knew I was going to talk about it was when we were in Mexico. We went to this beautiful course that's like right on the water, right by the ocean. It was almost empty. It was the windiest day. It was so windy. It was like he was playing like terribly because it was so windy. And that was a little bit, wind is very agitating. It's like super windy today. I had to close my security shutters on my treatment room here so that everything isn't rattling because the wind is blowing so hard. And that tends to be agitating, just energetically, emotionally. It stirs things up, like literally energetically. So it was super windy. Neither one of us was playing well, but it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful location. I had brought binoculars because it was like a birding space. And what I noticed was, as soon as we started, it was just him and me, which is also, I really enjoy because when they pair us with other people, I always feel like I'm taking up too much space. I would not have put it that way until I had this realization. I always feel like I'm slowing people down. I always feel like I'm making things harder for people because I'm not very good, which is funny because most people aren't great at golf. Most people are like passable at best. And I've had some experiences, especially when I was younger, where people were really terrible to me on a golf course. It's another place, kind of like the DMV, that tends to bring out the worst in people. Sometimes it's a very frustrating game, and I get it. And I also was able to see through this triggering how much work I still needed to do in holding my ground and taking up space and feeling worthy of just existing. So we were playing on this beautiful course. And there were people behind us, and I said to him, oh, I think we should let these people play through. As soon as there's people right behind us, I start getting triggered. I start messing up. I start feeling hurried. And I didn't want to feel that way because it was such a nice day. And so we kind of waited for them, and we're like, oh, you can go ahead and play through. And they're like, oh, we're not in a hurry, but if you want us to, we will. And they were just so lovely about it. They were like, oh, we're just out here having a great time. We're not in a rush. And that happened twice with 2 different couples that were in separate groups behind us. And all of a sudden I had this like realization, and I was like, oh, these people are not, this is not coming from outside of me. This is coming from inside of me. This is me saying, I'm not allowed to take up space. I'm not worthy enough to take up space on this golf course because of all of these things I'm telling myself. I'm not good enough. I'm too slow. I'm going to slow people down. I'm going to be in people's way, things like that. This was a projection because neither one of these 2 couples, they were both like, oh, well, we can, but like, we were happy to just be behind you and wait, and it's no problem. And it was a really interesting experience for me of realizing that this is a 3D space, physically and energetically, that triggers this feeling in me that I'm not allowed to take up space, that I'm not worthy to like even exist. Like I find myself like apologizing for, oh my God, I'm so sorry I'm here. Let me get out of your way. And I realized like this is just like I always say, the micro reflects the macro reflects the micro. So this is like a really specific example that I suddenly realized was like a microcosm of this broader feeling that I still have, that I am not worthy to be here, that I'm not worthy to exist, that I'm not worthy to take up space, that I should get out of the way and like cede the way to whoever is around because I should be apologizing for my very existence. And so I noticed it to the point that I was like, oh, I should do a show about this. And then kind of some other things happened, and it was kind of like percolating around in the background. So then we went to play golf here in Tucson a couple weeks ago, or like last weekend. I don't remember exactly when it was. And we went to this course, and I was like, all right, my goal today is to take up space. I'm not going to apologize for existing. I'm not going to apologize for slowing someone down. I'm just going to be in my space, and I'm going to occupy it. And if they don't like it, like, that's their problem. I was like in this kind of empowerment. I was really feeling like empowered about this. And it was very interesting because we were waiting on people in front of us. The course was kind of backed up, and that's how it goes sometimes. And we were in the middle of a hole, and this guy drove up like right as I was about to hit, which is not super polite. And he's like, hey, do you mind if I just play through? We'd like to play through. And there were 3 people in this group, one guy in one cart and 2 people in another cart. And I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. And I'm laughing now because usually it's the other way around. When I'm with my husband, I'm the one who's like, oh, whatever you need, I apologize for existing. Let me be uncomfortable so you can be comfortable in true codependent form. And I just blankly stared at this guy. I didn't say a word. And my husband was like, oh, yeah, okay, that's all right. That's fine. And I just looked at him, and he looked at me, and I was just like, I'm not going to apologize. And as soon as he drove off, I said to my husband, we're waiting on the people in front of us. Like, he's going to get in front of us, and then we're just going to be waiting on more people. Like, this is not an appropriate time to ask for that. And you can usually see when the people in front of you are waiting on people in front of them. Like, it was a good example of somebody sort of being entitled and rude, and me just holding my ground and just like, I didn't respond. And then later, the same guy said something to me that was like super condescending about, oh, you made a nice shot or something. And I was just like, oh, did I? I'm laughing now, but I just straight faced. I was like, oh, did I? Like, is that surprising to you? I didn't say that, but I just kind of like energetically, I was just like, I'm not going to be condescended to. I'm just not going to do it. And it was very empowering. It felt very good. And I think my husband was a little like surprised because, again, as women, we are taught from such a young age to acquiesce, to caregive, to put everybody else's needs before our own. And when I just stood there and didn't say anything, that's like, he does that sometimes to the point in conversation where I feel like I have to jump in because I can feel the other person's discomfort. And I was just like, I don't care if you're uncomfortable. You're being kind of an a-hole. So that happened. So then we went again earlier this week to a different course to play. And right away, it was bad. I was just playing really terribly. I just had no control over my ball. I was actually hitting it pretty well, but I think I hit one fairway. Like, I hit one straight enough where it wasn't like in somebody else's fairway or like off in the brush, which in Arizona is just rock and desert. I hit one like inside this like enclosure that had like an electrical, transformer or something in it. And I started realizing I was getting more and more and more triggered. And there was a couple of big realizations that I had. One of them was like, this is an extension of me feeling like I can't take up space. When I hit the ball and it goes like out of the place that it's supposed to go in, I immediately feel like I've done something wrong and like I'm going to hurt somebody, especially when it goes in someone else's fairway. You're supposed to yell 4, but like half the time I can't tell where my ball even goes and I don't have any control. And sometimes it goes to the right, sometimes it goes to the left. So I was like getting more and more triggered. Like I was like, oh my God, I'm going to hurt someone. Oh, my ball's going to hit someone and everyone's going to be mad at me. And at one point we had to like drive into someone else's fairway. And this lady was I couldn't hear her, but she was like making this face and like sending off energy like she was scolding me. And I was like, nobody was hitting. Like, I don't know if the ball came close and I didn't yell 4. I don't know. I've been yelled at many times on golf courses, which is one of the reasons I call it a 3D energetic space. It's a space that sometimes brings out the worst in people, including me. So I was getting more triggered. I was just like, my shots were getting worse. I was just getting really angry and frustrated. And then I sat down and I was like, okay. Because I sat back in the cart and he was playing and I was like, this is a really 3D space. And I was like, why am I even here? I'm not having fun. I'm not enjoying this. I should just be in 5D spaces. And I had this very 3D energetic, like either or, yes or no, all or nothing response of like, well, this doesn't serve me and I'm not doing it anymore. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute. And I said something to my husband. I was like, I don't like doing this. And he's like, oh, but we're outside and we're enjoying nature. And the wind was blowing a million miles an hour. So it really wasn't that enjoyable. But I was like, oh, we are outside. Like, I have a choice about whether I want my energy to be constricted, contracted, or expanded. Ultimately, I have a choice. Just like in the DMV, very contracted place where I was feeling very expanded. So I took a moment and I sat there and I allowed myself to get really expansive. And I was like, okay, this is okay. I can practice finding this expansion, finding this 5D space, even while I'm in this 3D energetic space. And this is good practice for me. It's like, it's bringing up, it's triggering some stuff that I need to work through. So then the other thing that came up was that I kept hitting my shots off the fairway and like really reacting to that, you know, hitting it and just being like, ah, like really kind of getting angry and annoyed. And at one point, like we drove up to the ball and I was like, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it was. Like it was just like 5 or 6 feet off the fairway. And I was actually hitting it almost as far as he was hitting it, because I was hitting from the women's tees and he was hitting from the men's or whatever they call it. So with the extra like yardage that I was getting, or less yardage, I was hitting them fairly well and pretty far. For the most part, I was making some pretty bold errors. But for the most part, I was actually, distance-wise, I was doing okay. I just didn't have any control. And so we drove up to the one and I was like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought. And my husband said to me, I don't know why you're so hard on yourself. None of these shots are as bad as you seem to think they are. You're just being really hard on yourself. And he actually said that to me a few times before it like penetrated the haze of like frustration and anger and neurodivergent, just kind of like, that I was in, where I was like, oh, this is another good example of a microcosm that's reflected in a larger like part of my life where I'm so hard on myself, where I always like judge myself much more harshly than anyone else. If anyone else had been hitting shots like that, I would have been like, look at how much distance you got. You're doing great. Like, it's okay. Just throw it back in the fairway, which I was doing because I didn't care. We don't really keep score. And like, but because it's me, and because I don't feel like I'm worthy of taking up space or even existing, I'm super hard on myself. And so I was getting more and more and more down on myself and more angry and frustrated. And then he said that maybe for like the 3rd or 4th time. It's like, I don't know why you're being so hard on yourself. He was playing a fantastic game. That's so like in contrast, I'm not trying to compete with him. It's like, it would be a fool's errand, but you know, he was playing really well, which was great. But it was also, that was making me feel like I was feeling even worse, because he, like, not only is he hitting, like he's trying to get a hole in one, like I'm just trying to freaking hit the ball. So after he said that to me a few times, I was like, oh, this is what we have to learn in the 3D. This is why we go into 3D spaces, knowing that we're probably going to get triggered, or that there's a very high possibility, because that is how we grow. We get into that discomfort zone, right? We talk about the green and the yellow and the red. Green being what my friend Barbara calls sustainable physiology. Yellow is the discomfort zone. That's where we learn. Red is the full trigger, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, falling down the embankment of freeze, hitting your ball into the other fairway and having someone yell at you. You can't even hear them over the wind. We go into those spaces in order to grow. And that is one of the reasons why we are not separating physically, and why even energetically, no matter how expanded we get, and no matter how we have these beautiful moments of going into the DMV and not getting triggered, we also have moments of going to the golf course, wherever else, and getting fully triggered. because that is showing us where we still need to do some work. That is showing us where we still have opportunities to grow and expand. Yeah. So that was actually more fun to talk about than it was to live through. So the big key component to this, as always in spiritual practice, is awareness. When we are stumbling along on the golf course, just fully triggered in our frustration and anger and stomping around and I'm never going to come back here and this is terrible and and we don't have any awareness around the depth of the triggering. This was triggering some very old stuff for me. This idea of allowing myself to be seen, allowing myself to take up space physically, emotionally, intellectually, energetically. My entire life, I have received messaging that I am too much. I am too loud. I am too smart. I am too weird. I am too, I don't know, I could go on. Too big. I'm too small. I've gotten both those messages, which is really strange. It's that too much or not enoughness. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. All of those things live so deeply inside of us that we need these 3D triggers in order to release them. And as we release a layer, there's a deeper layer. And then we release a layer and there's a deeper layer. And that can feel daunting. It can feel a little bit frustrating. And the more we excavate, the more opportunity for expansion we have. 20 years ago, I might have just said, I'm never going to play again. Or I might have actually thrown my club on the floor or pouted through the whole thing and not had any of these realizations because I wouldn't have had the awareness. 5 years ago, I would not have walked into the DMV and had the best time. 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have done that. So as we allow these 3D spaces to trigger us, to reflect back to us the things that we still need to work through, it allows us even more expansion, even more room to expand into that beautiful, loving, expansive 5D energy. And the cycle continues. And we go into spaces and realize how far we've come. And then we go into spaces and we realize there's always more path to travel. And for a lot of years, I found that, again, to be really daunting or sort of discouraging. And now what I realize is that it's a spiraling path. We're always making progress. It doesn't sometimes feel like it because sometimes it feels like we go back a little bit before we go up. Or it's the contraction and expansion. Without the contraction, we don't have the expansion. But the expansion always comes. And every time I work through the contraction in an aware way, in a conscious way, in an intentional way, that's the important thing here, the expansion gets even more wonderful, even more blissful, even more joyful, even more standing in the DMV, talking to angels and having the best day. There is a reason that awareness, that consciousness, that intentionality is so important in this work, because the contraction and the expansion is going to happen no matter what. It's what we do with that, what we do in those spaces, what we do internally to work with and through all of this old stuff so that we can find more and more and more expansion, more joy, more play, more pleasure. Golf is supposed to be fun. I'm not sure anybody really thinks that 100%. Even people who seem to be good at it find a lot of frustration in it. But again, the contraction leads to a bigger expansion. So then when you have a good shot, it's like, huzzah, I did it. Yeah. So I think I'm going to leave it there and just say, if you are enjoying the show, we would love to have you join us in the Spiritual Awakening Sanctuary. You will have access to all the amazing meditations and activations we do with each show. You'll have access to the bonus episodes that don't air with the rest of the podcasts. You'll have access to some exclusive discounts and a really lovely space in which to explore all of these topics that we talk about, including the 3D and the 5D with other like-hearted individuals. As we reclaim our power, we're being called to do that. especially right now on this day of the full moon eclipse. But this entire year of 2025 so far is really about reclaiming your personal power in order to serve. Everything we do leads us to expand, and the more expanded we are, the more we are of service just by existing. Just by standing in the DMV with our expansive energy, we are providing the opportunity for people to shift their vibration if they feel drawn to that, if they feel resonant to that. Have a beautiful rest of your day or evening, and I will see you on the next episode of Wind Down Wednesdays.